Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's University Business web seminar entitled A+ Higher Education Enterprise Software Selection, Implementation, and Success, which is brought to you by the generous support of our sponsor, Unit 4. As you can see, we have a poll that we would like everyone to answer when you have the chance. The poll will close once the presentation gets underway. I would also like to share just a few housekeeping items. First, for technical support, please use the chat panel, which is on the right side of your screen. You can select on my name, which is Stephen Blackburn, and type your message if you're having any technical issues, and I'll get back to you quickly. If you don't have computer speakers or if you prefer to listen privately, please dial the phone number and access code that I'll be posting in the chat window in a few moments. For this web seminar today, we will also be welcoming any questions that any of our attendees may have today with a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. To submit a question, please use the Q&A panel at the bottom right side of your screen and send your questions to all panelists, which is the default option. If you don't see the chat or the Q&A panels, please look to the right-hand side of your screen and click on the expand triangle, which is directly in front of the panel name, to make sure you have access to it. Also, something really quick to note, if you would like to access the web seminar at a later time, everyone who registered and who is attending today will also receive an email with a link to the slide and an archive recording. And with that, it is my pleasure to introduce to you one of our speakers today, Nick Schiavi. Nick is the Global Head of Higher Education and Nonprofit at Unit 4. Nick, it is great to have you with us.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it. It's good to be on. Thanks for the introduction. As Stephen mentioned, folks who are on, throughout the presentation, we're going to have a number of polls that are going to pop up in the panel as part of the webinar. Please feel free to take a moment and answer those questions, and we're very interested in your feedback. So today, what our team at Unit 4 is going to walk through is think of an A+ selection methodology around higher education enterprise software, focusing on selection tactics, implementation strategies, and how to ultimately achieve success. With me today are a number of folks on our team. So we have Austin Laird, who's one of our senior product managers, Elfie Smith, one of our strategic business analysts, Kizzy Holmes, one of our senior implementation consultants, and between all three of these folks, they've spent a considerable amount of time in all phases of enterprise software work within higher education. Let's get started. Today, we're going to cover a couple of different topics with you all. This is going to go step by step. First, we're going to focus on recognizing the need that your solution set may need to change. We'll look at recommendations on how to identify some of the requirements for those changes, some approaches to take, a framework for evaluation of solution options and vendor options, how to look at different types of vendors and evaluate what category of vendor might be the right one for your change project as you get into it. Then moving into deciding what that impact is going to be for that project and how you go about achieving it, as well as some common traps or mistakes that you want to avoid going through it. And then how you ultimately look at future-proofing what your new solution is going to be going forward. So starting off, step one is always to recognize some or many of the indicators that may be appearing that might show that you've outgrown what you're currently doing today. And what you'll notice is there are going to be a variety of signs. There could be any number of signs or indicators beyond even what we've just suggested here. But these are mainly going to be around your ability to plan, your ability to future-proof. So in a lot of these projects, when they start off, many institutions are asking themselves just how future-proof you really are. Are you able to meet challenges that are appearing today? COVID-19 has thrown a number of challenges our way in the whole higher education sector amongst all sectors. And it's really highlighted the need to plan, the need to stay ahead of the curve, and the need to be able to really future-proof your business going forward so that you're not so dependent on other areas to make changes as you need them. So, for example, are you finding challenges with the agility of your business or your institution to change? Compliance and reporting are changes that happen on an annual basis. How ready are you to handle those? Looking at data quality and data cleanliness, and ultimately the user experience, because as we all know, change is in the hands of the people who are using products and the people who are designing processes. If we don't have solutions in one product or many products that are really enabling our users to participate in change, then we're ultimately going to run into some challenges. So for example, are you having difficulty addressing and accessing key data points? Is it taking more than just a couple of minutes to be able to go through and find data that you need for reporting? Does it seem like there are just too many cooks in the kitchen working on the same Excel sheet from time to time with different versions? Are your teams looking for ways around your systems and your processes instead of actually using them to accelerate through? These might be indicators that you're outgrowing what you're working on today. When you want to change business processes, we speak to many folks who are finding they need to look outside their business. When there's change that's needed, whether it's small or large, external help is usually the first challenge or the first solution that's sought to consult on how to do it. You might be observing that there are processes that need to adapt or change to market conditions or scale, and you just don't have those tools in place. And that's a lot of what we've really seen throughout COVID, is that processes need to change, need to account for changes in student and faculty and staff needs at the drop of a hat, and you're just not unable to do so. Again, it comes down to people. Your people and your data. There are sometimes everyone encounters the phrase of having multiple versions of the truth. And or if you're spending too much time trying to really understand what's going on with your institutional data, there's probably something else you need to look at to handle it. Compliance and reporting, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that typically requires a lot of ongoing time investment. And as solutions mature, as processes mature, there are better ways to handle the repeated processes of compliance and reporting answers. So that's the first step. But let's start taking a look at some of these other steps. So really, how do you start looking at factors to include in your checklist? Austin, do you have any suggestions here?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. So, as Nick talked about, he talked about thinking of, at what point or what are the signs that we're ready to start looking for a new, major shift in our applications, our ERP, our SIS, whatever our back office we're concerned with. And he talked about future-proof, which, as we've all learned, sometimes future-proof happens today. All of a sudden, we have to be concerned with things that we didn't think we would have to be concerned with for years. Things changed overnight, right, with the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, as your mindset starts to shift towards, okay, maybe I do need to consider moving to a new set of applications, what are some other things we need to do, particularly on your campus, to start thinking about being ready for that? Where do we even begin? As we'll talk about, a lot of institutions we work with will start with, an RFP process or looking to outside consultants, and that's obviously a key part. But another part is just thinking about taking inventory and taking stock of what you have today. Are you prepared to consider a large new implementation? If in your institution, if you haven't, for instance, considered your data management strategy, your identity and access management strategy, and other foundational campus technology strategies. I bring those up because without considering what you're going to need to do with the data you have, it's hard to determine, what your goals should be. As Nick mentioned, maybe you're having challenges with reporting. Maybe part of that challenge is just understanding the data you have at your institution and how you want to manage that, right? Identity and access is key, particularly as we think about from day to day. We don't know if our people are going to be on campus, if they're going to be off campus. It's a different world than we've dealt with in the past, and it foundationally becomes part of your technology strategy you need to consider across the board. There's some typical things we all do, scanning the market, what's the latest and greatest. There are so many new vendors in our higher ed space that it's great to consider, look at analysts, follow various leaders in the industry, and just understand what is the latest and greatest. What's the newest, not only technology, but application of technology coming to institutions. Another area I like to think about is, where can you leverage, as an institution, the relationships you have with other institutions in terms of vetting solutions out. Maybe you work together and partner together to look at different solutions. Where can you take advantage and leverage purchasing consortia or contract vehicles where they've already gone through and vetted out a vendor. Maybe they've vetted out a lot of the functionality you're looking for in your ERP or your student system. How can you take advantage of those things? And what we're finding and what I've found is that when you start to think about these different aspects, and obviously this is just the tip of the iceberg, but it's some key things that we wanted to bring forward to think about in a checklist. What is my checklist? It's not just looking at what my current application does that I want to replace. It's thinking about the whole ecosystem around it and thinking about how you support that and make it sustainable. With that, I'm curious, if some of my other panelists, for instance, Kizzy, if you might have something you would like to add to this part of the discussion.
Yeah, I think you're really spot on, Austin, as far as, really institutions looking to really future-proof their decisions, right? They want to be thinking ahead versus trying to really just assess, okay, we're having this issue now and only address that issue, because you're going to end up in the same spot or same place of, okay, we only thought, so far in advance, and we're now back in a position where what we chose to go through or utilize short term is still not meeting our needs, 3 years, 5 years down the road. So definitely want to think ahead, think about trends and where the industry, where you're going. As you said, COVID-19 threw everybody, I think, for a loop, right? So a lot of institutions maybe before were really more so looking at on-prem solutions and things like that, where now they're looking forward or more at, cloud-based solutions, things that provide flexibility as well as mobility for their users who may now have to work from home. So I think those are definitely areas to consider when you're doing your selection or looking at, what is it you're needing for the future, what's required versus what are nice to have as you're getting into that process of searching for new software.
Yeah, thanks, Kizzy. I think part of what you said made me think more about, this whole notion of future-proof, right? Nick brought it up, and you mentioned it, and I mentioned it. And part of that I like to think about is that it's, you can't insulate yourself from change, right? That change is happening to you in this case.
Absolutely.
There's some things you can control, but there's so many things you really can't insulate yourself from. And really being prepared to adapt to it, though, right? And laying the best foundation we can in that preparation is important when we think about future-proof. So back to you, Nick.
Yeah, that's a good point, Austin. Everyone gets obsessed with the phrase of future-proofing, but we all know it's an impossibility, right? It's really about how able are you to handle change. And, on that topic, let's talk through the next point around it, which is, what do you start to do to manage change? Because managing change really comes down to enabling your people and how they're going to really drive change for you. So, Elfie, you have spent a lot of time and a lot of your career on digital transformation and change management. I'm curious, could you talk us through a little bit of your perspective on what change management starts to look like and how it really sticks?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll just draw everyone's attention to another poll that's on the side if you have a chance to answer that. But thanks, Nick. And I tried when you were speaking, Nick, to actually count how many times the word change has been used already in this presentation.
What did you get up there?
I couldn't keep track. And then Austin used it as well. So great segue, but what that really highlights is the criticality around focusing on the people who are impacted by these digital transformation projects. And so we recognize, of course, that every change impacts how people are going to be doing their work. And technology projects really are only successful if the people who need to be using the new systems and be implementing the new processes are feeling comfortable and able to do that. So we know that we talked about business process change. Every digital transformation presents both an opportunity and a requirement to review business processes. We know in some cases that workflows will change, or we want to automate previously manual processes and workflows. So change management is something that I encourage people to look at very early when they're looking at these types of major projects. And what it does is it ensures that we can initiate actions that focus on the people side of the project, focus on providing training, providing the right tools, ensuring that people have all of the skills and comfort that they need to successfully operationalize the new systems and processes. And one of the things that I really like to encourage people to think about is just to recognize that every individual will have a different response to change, and there really is a spectrum of responses. And, you know, sometimes we tend to have, we focus really heavily on the one end of the spectrum that is perhaps the more negative response to change, and we think about how we can manage that. But really, it's important that we look at the full spectrum and we recognize the people within our institutions that have a really, really positive feeling about a change and see opportunity with these digital transformations, and that we ensure that we focus on them as well as those individuals at the other end of the spectrum who might be feeling uncertain or might have feelings of you know, that might be skeptical about the project. So the other thing I want to point out, of course, is that it's important to recognize that these responses to change are not fixed. So all of the actions that you take around communicating about the need for these types of projects, you know, what is the business risk associated with not going forward with some of these initiatives, right? Making sure that your broad spectrum of stakeholders understands the business need for it can help move people away from those responses of uncertainty or skepticism and be able to get behind and support the project. And it's just as important to recognize that those who are excited about the opportunity, that we take action to give them the opportunity to play a role in these types of projects, and that they can participate. And of course, if we do all of that, then if we focus on the people, we know that we will have a much higher success rate of actually completing these projects and realizing the benefits that we desire to, you know, improve our student experience or improve our staff experience and everything else that we're hoping to gain.
Yeah, thanks, Elfie. I think that's a really valuable perspective. I know that you've done a lot of this and you've led a lot of this for years, but it really does come down to how you really enable your people to handle change, to be prepared for it. But then coming from that, it's really how you start to get your people to take the next step and lead through what the inevitable evaluation process is going to be. So next, this is going to be a question to all three of you as panelists. How do you start building a framework to evaluate potential vendors to tackle your challenge? And I'll ask all three of you to answer. Austin, can I start with you?
Yeah, thanks, Nick. Yeah, so here we've decided we need to make a change. We've talked about how to manage it. We've talked about some early criteria to think about. And in that early criteria, you know, we already mentioned kind of the market scan and the request for information or request for proposal or bid process, which is, as everyone knows that's experienced it before, can be an intense and very time-consuming process. You know, when we think about this framework for evaluating vendors, because that's going to really be the anchor, right, in our process of determining what our future state applications are, what we decide to implement on campus and how we decide to implement them. This framework, you know, thinking about this weighted factor approach is key. One of the things I like to think about is, okay, how do we take advantage, first of all, of, you know, we're in sort of a future-proof and ensuring that we have a sustainable environment going forward. How do we bring that into this process? And one of those ways is, you know, I think everyone on the call has probably seen and probably dealt with the RFPs that have 500 questions. You know, a lot of times all that's doing, it kind of reflects on what Kizzy was mentioning, which is all that's really doing is saying, here's what I have today, and here's exactly how I do it today, and I want a system that does exactly what I do today. That's not really our goal, right? Our goal is to be more aspirational, and our goal is to think, okay, what can I do with this framework to evaluate vendors and yet understand how, as an institution, a vendor might align to my aspirational goals. And a couple of things to talk about there, you know, one is you're going to do your vendor due diligence, right? I mean, you have to do that. That's foundational, whether it's about financial health of the vendor, their commitment to the industry, and, of course, pricing and key things like that. You're going to talk about the implementation process and what it looks like post-implementation. But a couple of key things that I think are different to think about today than have been in the past. Number one is the customer community around a vendor. And what I mean is a big part of being successful in a SaaS world is how you can interact not just with your single stream support person at a vendor, but the community around a vendor. How can you, it's people at your institution, they're at the center of the processes that this framework has to describe. Well, once it's implemented, how do I get support, right? So sort of evaluating that community where I can go and contribute and bring back things, learnings from my institution is really valuable and really important. Another thing that's in the process here that I like to think about is, we've been seeing some really successful evaluations that are done more in a scenario, more with scenarios in mind. So you can tell when an institution has done some scenario planning and they've thought, okay, it's not just that I need to be able to register a student the way that student is today. I have these aspirations to bring in students from a different country, students of a different demographic, whatever that may be. Hey, Mr. Vendor, walk us through a scenario. Don't just check the box. Let's walk through a scenario of how I would accomplish a particular process, and then aspirationally for the institution, how that process might look in that new world. So I think that kind of scenario-driven approach, and then with your framework taking into account meeting the requirements through scenarios is hugely valuable. I think, I'd like to ask Kizzy or Elfie. Kizzy, do you have anything you'd like to add to the sort of framework discussion?
Yeah, you made some really good points, Austin. I think, something I mentioned earlier as well. Again, what are you looking for as far as your future goals, and how the vendor aligns with that? As well, I was going to say, what sort of training or support is provided. So what you were saying about, the community that's there is very important as well. But in addition to that community, I think a lot of times people do focus on, specific functionality, approaching it, of this is the requirements that we want to be met, but you also have to think about, again, the people and how are you going to support your people, both during the implementation and then after. What sort of support is provided by that vendor? Do they have, kind of just-in-time type of trainings? Do they have, self-help options or other trainings that are available or will be available to you and your people, post-implementation as well? Going back to something you said earlier about, the ecosystem, right? So as you determine what your needs are, is it that maybe one vendor can meet that for you, right? If you are able to evaluate and see that, okay, we need certain things and we can get it, say, from one place, great. That's kind of one point of contact. But if not, if you have other software or other things that you need to have in your ecosystem, does that vendor integrate with those other systems? Is there already an integration set up, or is the ability to integrate with those other systems readily available? So that's another thing to think about as well as part of the process. I don't know, Elfie, do you have anything else you want to add, maybe?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is that this is a really good opportunity as well to look internally within your institution and consider who can be involved in the evaluation process. And you can be very strategic about that in terms of getting participation. And it is strategic, right? The evaluation team or committee, you don't want it to be too large, but you also want to ensure that you have good representation from the stakeholder groups that will be impacted by the end result. So through that selection and evaluation process, ensuring that you're gathering input and feedback from the appropriate stakeholder groups is really important.
So this is one of those areas where, it's where the rubber starts to meet the road, right? I think that's what each of you are highlighting here, is that this is a really big part of any process. It's a really critical one because you're determining how you're going to start initiating change. And if you go back out to Elfie, what you said in terms of how you start handling change and how you enable people, this is where you're picking the people and the different opinions and the viewpoints in terms of how stuff is going to come together, highlighting what's important, what's not, and then how to start beginning the decision what the solution is going to be. So this is a pretty critical step. Next, once you start going through that piece and you're assembling your team and your framework, then start to look at how you understand the different types of vendors. Now, there's lots of vendors in lots of different spaces, and you can't really do a comprehensive review of everybody because it's just too time consuming. It's not something that's going to create an efficient process. But what you can do is you can start to categorize and focus down segment by segment. So, Austin, I know you've got a couple of viewpoints on this. Can you tell us a little bit about what you start to do in terms of the segmentation or evaluation of types of vendors?
Yeah, so I think everyone brings to the table their experiences with vendors on their campus today, right? And everyone, we may be at a virtual EDUCAUSE this year, but we'll go to somewhere like EDUCAUSE and we go to the vendor floor and we see, all the names and lights, and some are new, some have been around for 40 years or longer. One of the aspects of picking a vendor today in an industry like ours in higher ed is thinking about, not only where a vendor has come from and who they are today in the industry, but what type of products do they provide, what markets do they serve, what industries do they serve, and when they do that, how are they approaching it? So, this slide here is from one of those analysts, I talked about. I mean, you might look at Gartner and Tambolini and others. Constellation Research, this particular slide is talking about the notion of kind of product-centric versus service-centric vendors, and lays them out on this mapping where we think about, okay, as an example here at Unit 4, our whole world revolves around our people experience and thinking about service industries like higher education. Part of what that means when we look at a product is we say, okay, I'm not interested in putting manufacturing and a widget at the center of my product. I'm interested in putting people at the center of my product. And that has an impact on the product that gets developed, the solution that gets delivered, the service that's offered for you. And so one aspect that I find is actually a fairly new concept today is to think about, well, where does the human fit in this application? And when you're thinking about a vendor, how do they think about where people fit in the process? And are they focused on getting widgets to market really fast? Or are they focused on serving students, serving nonprofit organizations? What's their mindset? And I like this illustration just because it does give you a sense. You'll see some of the vendors you work with all the time in higher ed. Not all of them are on here, but it gives you a sense of kind of where you could place them on a product-centric versus a services-centric methodology.
Austin, this really comes down to principles of the vendor, right, and what their ongoing alignment is going to be and how well that fits your organization. Is that fair summation?
Yes, that's a great way to put it, Nick. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's a critical point, right, because if you want to make sure that you're aligning with a service provider who's aligned with your mission as well as closely as possible. Obviously, they're never going to be exactly aligned with what you do, but you can get close enough to know that the direction you're going as an institution is going to be aligned with the categorical direction of vendors going to go.
Yep, absolutely.
So then if we start to get through the categorization, the next bit is, and again, if we roll back to the whole concept of change and what change is going to look like, you start evaluating the types of vendors and the types of solutions. You get to that point. Then it's really starting to look at the scope of the project and what that impact is going to be across your organization. Elfie and Kizzy, you both deal with a lot of this on a daily basis in terms of how projects impact customers and how projects impact people at every institution and the different organizations there. Can you both discuss a little bit more about this? Kizzy, do you want to start?
Sure, yes. Projects like transformational projects or implementations like this have a huge impact across an organization. And really, as you start out defining what the scope of that project is just sets you up for success in the future and throughout the project. Really making sure that you have the right people involved. I think as Elfie and Austin mentioned before as well, you want to make sure even before you start, right, that you have done some pre-work in planning around what are the types of scenarios you want the software to be able to manage. Who are the people, who are the right people that need to be involved in the implementation or in the project at various levels as well. Because, once you start that implementation process, the end goal is, to implement, but also to have that software be adopted, right? To have your users use it on a daily basis to do their jobs. So, it can have, this whole process can have impacts that are broad reaching from, again, the processes that you do on a day-to-day basis, the other tools that you might use, your people, how they may be impacted, right? How it could, mean that there's been change in structure of how people do business, or the people that are, in a particular department, things like that. So it definitely has really broad-reaching impact across the business.
Thanks, Kizzy. Elfie, what do you think?
Yeah, I think that's a really good kind of holistic summary. And the only things I would add are just a few little kind of more specific notes about in terms of the impact on your organization and the institution. We recognize that there will be a requirement for subject matter experts from across the institution to participate at certain points. So recognizing that early on and acknowledging that it will take some of their time, and if there's a necessity to try to backfill or enable them to have that time to participate, that's really important. And on that note, just a really good reminder that there will be some departments that will be impacted most significantly, and there can be a tendency to focus very heavily and solely on those, but it is also important to reach out every once in a while to the department beyond that. So you're implementing an ERP system, you might think that the institutional library isn't that significantly impacted, but perhaps they are. So just making sure that you look at all of the different departments and organizations across the institution to make sure we get the subject matter experts involved when we need them on the project. The other piece is ensuring that you have a project sponsor who has the authority to make quick decisions, who can facilitate policy changes if necessary. And so, considering the impact of that, you do need at least one, perhaps two sponsors that can really make sure that decisions can be made in an expedited way to get through these projects.
So we're talking about lots of stuff that we need to do, but let's actually put it right back to you guys who've spent so much time in these projects. What are some of the things that you've all seen from your experiences that are indicators that there are mistakes that might threaten a project's success? And I'll put it right back to Kizzy based on a lot of your experience with projects themselves. What are you seeing?
Yeah, so Elfie just called one out, right? Not having, say, a strong executive sponsorship of the project. That is something that is can lead to a project not going well or is a big mistake. I would say along with that, sometimes with projects like this, there's not a dedicated project manager on the institution side that is helping to plan and really just track and make sure that the project from the institutional standpoint and the things that need to be coordinated on the institution side are happening in the time frame that they need to happen. So I would say that's a big one as well. Something Austin mentioned earlier in the way of, data, making sure that as you're getting into such an implementation that you're looking at what are the things that you need to do as an institution on your side as well. So not just a strategy about, okay, what sort of data are we going to, have migrated or bring over to the new system, but is our data that we are going to bring over clean? Have we gone through it? Have we assessed it? Do we know, what data we do actually have and the condition that it's in before we start that process? So those are things that are really important as well. And I would say, again, something that Elfie mentioned as well around the people. Sometimes with some of these projects, a lot of times, there may be a great emphasis put on on like IT, right? Looking at the technical folks, right? And their availability and what might be, what you might have to put on them or what things they may have to do. But it's very important to also, look across those other areas, subject matter experts, those other people or those other departments that are participating in the process and, really assess and evaluate what is the work that they're doing. If it's a situation where during an implementation, you're expecting them to do their normal day job plus implement, right? What does that mean then for those resources and even their morale during an implementation? So those are things that you definitely want to think about and plan for. Elfie, I don't know if it's...
Kizzy?
Okay, yeah. You're welcome.
The only quick thing that I would add is just, trying to incorporate too much customization. So really making sure that you focus on the core needs that you have, prioritize those needs, prioritize those critical functional elements that are required. And when you come to a point where you recognize that, the way you're doing something today is not going to be replicated, and you start to go down that path of thinking, let's try to customize, I would just suggest, stop and think really hard about that because it can lead to a lot of problems. I'll pass it on to you, Austin. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that or add.
No, Elfie, you said it wonderfully. That's exactly what I was going to add is just that idea that, pretty much, I believe all of us pretty much have worked in or certainly with institutions. I know I worked at an institution where I helped move from a mainframe to a more modern application. And one of the things, exactly what you just said, like when we talk about common mistakes, I think the biggest common mistake is to think that your software you've been running for 25 years is going to exactly be replicated in some new SaaS environment, whoever the vendor is, whatever the product is, whatever we're talking about, because that's just not reality. That can't happen. Maybe in another 20 years we'll have that. I don't know, but maybe we don't want that. So it's something to think about. Exactly to your point, just supporting what you said, that idea that we really need to think about what's the core, what are we really trying to accomplish, and where do we want to be, not where are we coming from.
Very good. Thanks for the viewpoints on that. Yeah, and I think the last piece is really looking at, once you've gone through all this, once you've identified the issues, once you've recognized that some change is necessary, you're looking at how you start to identify options for that. You've enabled your people, right? This all comes back to people on every single team, whether you're on the vendor side or the institution side, you're looking at how your people are going to enable a change project. And a whole process around it. You've gone through your vendor selection, you've identified your framework, you've built this thing out. Inevitably, at the end of this always requires stakeholders. You always have people within your institution. You have to ensure that you're going to be able to scale and succeed with it. You need to have buy-in from everyone around the table because you need support. Every team needs support and leadership to get through this. And one of the things that we've started doing at Unit 4 is looking at what really is the true cost of not taking action on some of this. In many cases, if you've identified the indicators that are slowing you down or getting in your way and disabling you from being able to make that change or initiate a change process, you're looking at a lot of core technology that's going to cause problems. So when it comes to options to do that and to build your case internally, what we've done is we've designed a free service called a business value review. It's something that offers the opportunity to have a brief discussion with a consultant looking at overall business value to help you really develop the business case together for your institution. It becomes your business case, something that you're able to then make your own, to be able to work on and own internally. It gets you started on making that case for change and being able to position that with all of your stakeholders internally. It's data-driven with your numbers, your viewpoints. It's tailored to your organization's needs. And it's something that you can help to use to make the case to internal stakeholders to show that really the cost of doing nothing is going to outweigh the cost of engaging on a change process. So thanks very much for joining us today. And Stephen, I believe we are opening it up to Q&A at this point.
Yes, definitely. Thank you again for all of your insights. So as Nick was saying, yes, we do have some time now for a Q&A where our panelists from Unit 4, they will answer any of the questions that you may have. So for those of you who have not yet submitted a question, you can please do so now by submitting your question in what is called the Q&A panel, which should be located below the chat panel at the bottom of your screen. So we'll get to your questions once we have time to do so. So the first question that we have that just came in, it's about business value review. So at what stage in the process, of a new project would you all recommend doing a business value review?
That's a great question. Ultimately, that should be one of the first things you do. And if you're going to initiate a project, you want it to have the right context. The right context is going to be what the intent of the project is going to mean to the overall institution, the people, the mission, and everything else. The earlier in your process you start to look at how to compile the value of change, the better. And probably the more you're going to start to develop what that answer really is. We actually do the same process on our side too. When we identify that there's something that needs to change, the first thing we'll do is we'll go through and look at, okay, what would a change mean to our business? Is it going to impact our business positively? Is it going to impact our customers positively? And very similarly with institutions, you want to look at that very early on. If you're seeing some indicators that you've got issues in responding to future-proofing or managing change, or you've got challenges and frustrations with your people and serving processes, start to look at what it would take and what would be the cost of not doing anything about it and how that's going to impact the morale of your people. So do it early, do it often if need be, but iterate it and don't make it something that's just done once and static.
Perfect. Thank you for that. Another question, this is about change management and project management offices. Where should change management ownership lie, if a higher ed institution doesn't have, a CM or PM office?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and take that one and just jump in if anyone has anything to add. But, for institutions that don't have full capacity in-house for change management, we really, of course, do need an internal project manager. That is important. And I do think that it's possible for that internal change that change management activity to be led by the project manager as well. Those two roles are so heavily interconnected that certainly is possible. I've also worked with some institutions that can rely somewhat on an internal communications office to help with some of that work. But I also think that there can be a lot done by the sponsors or the leaders who are, the key leads in each department that's impacted. So whether that's, a chief financial officer, a registrar, there are key roles that can assist with the change management activities. And of course, vendors can often provide that support in that area as well.
Thank you for that. Just a quick reminder to everyone, we still have some time for Q&A, so if you have any questions, please submit them into the Q&A panel. If you don't see it, you should scroll to the right-hand side of your screen. There should be 3 dots. You can click on that, and then you should see the Q&A panel pop up. So before we get to that, another question. One of our biggest challenges, someone said, is executive sponsorship. Do you have any recommendations for them to kickstart that?
There's lots of ways to do it. The biggest and the best one that we've seen, because again, like I mentioned, we approach things the same way when we find challenges here. You look at who's feeling the most pain or the most challenge within the senior management team or the leadership team, or someone who's got the wherewithal to take stakeholder ownership. Who's impacted the most? I know we've hit on this point a couple of different times throughout the conversation about change comes down to people, enablement comes down to people. The whole process comes down to people and who's really going to feel the most pain or have the most gain from some sort of change. And that's probably the person. If you're observing some signs that say this is probably the right time to look at a change, work through your organization and see which stakeholder is really the person who's most impacted by that. Engage that person and start talking about the ideas and bring up the idea of saying, well, maybe we should go back and we should take an assessment of what a change would start to look like. And is it going to be more impactful to begin a change process, or is staying where we are going to be the right place?
Perfect. Thank you very much. So before I answer another question, just a quick reminder again, submit your questions in the Q&A panel so we can answer them for you. Thank you. We have another question. How do you suggest evaluating purchasing consortia? So, how would they know if the solutions will meet their needs?
So I think there's a couple ways to do that. A lot of institutions right now, a lot of organizations in general are taking a shared services approach. It's a topic that has been sort of discussed and probed on and off for years, and looking at the balance of coming together as institutions or engaging or engaging vendors en masse to look at where you can find the opportunity to share services, to distribute the workload, to do something once and be able to run it in a variety of institutions. A lot of times this comes down to, I think one of our panelists identified this earlier, of not letting scope creep get in the way. You're going to have less luck pulling together dozens or a couple of hundred institutions to put together ideas on what change looks like, but a couple of institutions or a couple of people and teams that are like-minded is probably the right way to start. If you've got areas where you can agree on common definitions, then that's something that can start the process. If you can start to come together and focus on what you do and find some common need, it usually comes down to the principle of factoring out the lowest common denominator. There's no silver bullet for it, but you want to look at where you agree on things or where you could potentially agree on things to make things simpler.
Perfect. Thank you for that. And right before I move on, I just want to let everyone know that if you submitted a question and we weren't able to get to it, the Unit 4 team will be getting back to you following this presentation. All right. Well, thank you again for all of you at Unit 4 for letting us be a part of this inspiring discussion, and for your time and your expertise. We really appreciate it, and our audience especially. And I would like to thank our attendees also for joining us today. For those of you who sat in and really enjoyed what you saw, there are many more upcoming web seminars here at UB, like this one that University Business provides, which is the leader in all editorial coverage of news, trends, and current issues in higher ed. At UB, our wide range of readers, they subscribe for us for free and stay up to date with us through our print magazine, the digital edition, which accompanies our magazine, newsletters, and web seminars like this one. Also, for those of you who would like to watch this web seminar again, or if for those of you who believe that the solutions provided from Unit 4 would be helpful to your colleagues, we will be pleased to know that an archive recording of this web seminar will be available, which you can see at the URL provided on your screen. You can also expect to receive an email from our team here at UB later today or early tomorrow, which will include a link to all of the slides that you saw. And so with that, on behalf of University Business, this is Stephen Blackburn. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your school year. Take care.